So I'd like to introduce Wendy and Ivan from Queensland, which is the northeasternmost state of Australia. Victoria is pretty south. Tasmania is even further south. We've got New South Wales for hours around here. And my sister lives in Noosa, which is in the subtropical part of Australia. It's a similar latitude to southern Florida. Wendy and Ivan's Noosa backyard, it's got a 10-frame flow hive, that's it there, and 2 Australian stingless bee colonies. There they are there. And there's their backyard, and that's Ivan actually. The hive, you can just see it peeking out behind the flowers there. Their backyard backs onto a road reserve. The bees can fly over and have access to all these eucalypts and other plants. And that has meant that over the years that they've had the flow hive, they've been able to get quite a lot of honey. Now, looking at the stingless bee hives, when I looked, which was middle of the day, quite sunny, they were out. And you'll see in a moment the bees going in and out the entrance. So there's one entrance. So I'll show you that. They're quite small, 4 millimeters in length. I mean, as you can see them, but you've got to sort of stare. And they do collect pollen. You may have noticed in the video I just showed you that one went in with pollen. Each year, a hive this size, like their mature hives with 2 or 3 boxes, they can produce up to a litre of honey. But Wendy and Ivan have got them there just for interest and maybe to support the local population. They are found in trees, and if the trees are chopped down, that's the end of the colony. So up there's rescue procedures where people do collect the nest when the tree's cut down and rehive it, something like we do with European honeybees. But their main use for having the native stingless bees is for pollination. Horticulturally, they're very important for pollinating macadamias, which are a native plant to Australia, and mangoes, and also to use in glass houses because European honeybees don't go well inside enclosed glass houses. So here's a video of the second hive. And Wendy and Ivan did comment that they're not really like European honeybees. They tend to start maybe as soon as the sun's up, they start going out and foraging. These ones wait a little while, and at night they close over the entrance with propolis to prevent against invaders. There are some wasps that do parasitize them. Sometimes European honeybees do cover the entrance, but generally not overnight and generally not completely.
Do the bees do you have frames in there, or do they build their own comb structure?
Answer that question in the next slide, Christian, okay? So this is a photo taken, I think, from a managed hive, and you can see it here on the right, of what the brood pattern is of this particular species. There are 4 species that are colonial of stingless bees in Australia, and 2 main ones are kept in hives, certainly at this part of Queensland. You can see here inside a tree, there's the nest there. It's not till you're actually able to look at it from the top that you can see it's got a spiral pattern, and each species of the stingless bees has got a different spiral pattern. The beehives are about 200 millimetres wide, about 280 millimetres long, and they can occupy 3 sections, which overall would be about 300 millimetres high. A new hive is created by removing a middle section, say this had the brood in it, and putting it on a base, and then putting a lid on it, and then when it's big enough, put a second one on, and it takes about a year for the new colony to reach full size. Their reproduction is a little bit different, is that they have a number of queens inside the hive. So when they're establishing a new colony, the bees go out and find a new space. They produce queens here, so there's a number of queens here, and then some queens eventually go out to the new place. So in some respects, it's a little bit easier to make a new colony. You physically just do split it. You don't have to worry about making certain it's got a queen. Now you may wonder, okay, seems really great that Ivan and Wendy got this very interesting native colony of stingless bees. How come they've ended up getting a European honeybee colony? Well, this is a bit of a story that a lot of people say in Melbourne, and I reckon in New Zealand and Maryland, the reason they've got beehives is the same story. Wendy and Ivan were concerned about the decrease in numbers of a rare parrot, a pale-headed rosella. There it is there in the Noosa area. It's a rosella that's mainly found in more northern latitudes. So they decided, with the support of a local organisation, to put a nesting box in a tree in the nearby road reserve. And here's a nesting box in Noosa, but not the one that they had. And you can see it was actually taken up by this rare parrot. But as you know, and this is what happened to Wendy and Ivan's, if you've got a box in a tree, sometimes European honeybees take that up as a residence. And that's exactly what happened with Wendy and Ivan's. This is not a photo of theirs, but it's a photo of another one in Noosa taken a few years ago. And you can see that actually they've covered the entrance partly in propolis. Wendy and Ivan's were so strong that honeycomb actually came out the entrance, obviously. They were thriving. But it produced a swarm. It went to a tree, and Wendy and Ivan collected that and transferred it to a friend's spare flow hive and placed it in their backyard. So that's how they got the flow hive. Later, this same nest in the road reserve produced a swarm the following year. So here's what this looked like. There's a big one. So they arranged for two fairly elderly beekeepers in their 90s, brothers, who lived in Noosa, to come and collect that. Eventually, the nest became infected with small hive beetle and was removed. So what we decided to do is to have a look inside the flow hive and see how it was going. In contrast to the stingless bee colonies, the flow hive's entrance had very little activities, just a few bees going in and out, and did notice one taking in a bit of pollen. It's got a single brood box separated by a plastic excluder, and then on the top it's got 6 flow frames. In total, it would be 10 normal frames in width. When Ivan and Wendy inspect their hive, they put the small table next to it, and that's convenient because they can place items on it rather than on the ground, which is a little bit crowded. And Wendy had looked at the hive about a month ago, and they thought it had become queenless. So they obtained a frame of brood and eggs from a friend, going to see what effect that had on the hive. So opened the flow frame box, and it was about a third full of capped honey. And you can see here, there's a capped honey. Wendy and Ivan had recently harvested at least 1 and maybe 2 frames of honey, which they found fairly easy to do because they just put in the tool, twisted it, and it come out the tube at the back. If you have a look at this frame here, you will notice that a lot of the cells are covered in fairly old wax, but some of them are covered by what appears to be new wax. And the reason for that, I think, is they've maybe had some empty cells. Maybe at some stage the bees removed the cap from a few cells and started to consume the honey inside, then refilled it and recapped it. Here's one of the empty frames that they'd previously harvested maybe 6 weeks or so ago. So the brood box, then we had a look, and very few bees. They weren't aggressive. Only a few bees were collecting pollen. There were no eggs or larvae on frames, but there were a few capped drone cells. So you can see here, there's a few capped drone cells. Would anyone like to volunteer a reason why we've got a few capped drone cells? but no eggs or larvae or capped worker cells.
Barry?
Yes, good on you, Viv. You're going to volunteer.
Yeah, I'll volunteer. I think what possibly it could be is that they're the residual from the frame of brood that was put in, and that the females have all hatched out, and all that's left is the few males that are a few days behind, maybe.
Yes, I think that's the explanation. And when we went back a few days later, I think they'd gone. So thank you for that. So some of the frames you can see are joined fairly well to the base and the sides. So we can lift those up and put them at an angle and look, have the sunshine in the cell and see if there's any eggs. But others, they were not really joined to the side and the bottom. So when we tried to put, for example, this frame up at an angle to see if there were any eggs, because it was not attached, it just went with gravity and we couldn't see it if there's any eggs there. So that was a bit of a nuisance, unfortunately. So what I suggested to Wendy and Ivan is that we get some frames that have got wax foundation on them and remove some of the bare frames or the old ones. I mean, that's a pretty old frame. The bees generally like something a bit fresher than that. So it has been used. That might be from their friend's hive, actually, because it's got the drone brood capped. So what we did is we did a bit of a Google search and found the nearest beekeeping shop. And that was at a place called Yandina, about 35 kilometres away. Pretty small place as far as people go, but a very large bee shop. They had almost everything that you could think of bee-wise. They had some hives out the front with bees in them. Two things that they produced themselves, instead of wooden boxes, they got fairly heavy plastic and they cut it and screwed them together and put a stainless steel handle on each edge to make it easy to lift. And each box had they called it a ventilation hole, which could be used. You could also use it to close off the entrance if you were moving that box for some reason. Ivan bought one of those because I suggested that they need a spare box. They only had the two and need a spare box for some contingencies in the future. They're also looking to get some ventilated suits. The ones I had were full-length cotton, which were pretty hot in Noosa, which is 30 degrees and fairly humid. They did have homemade ones, but I suggested maybe we'll look around and look at some of the other ones that are available before they purchased a suit. These came in two parts, a jacket and a bottom, so I was a bit concerned that wasn't a good connection between the two there. It only, I think, relied on the elastic holding this to you. And then what we wanted to buy was some foundation, and they had plenty. In fact, they had their own foundation making machine. They bought local wax, melted it and produced their own wax foundation. A bit cheaper here than in Victoria. I think it was $2.50 a sheet. Down here, it's about $3.10 a sheet. So they have to just, I guess, go with their market up there. 3 days later or so, we replaced the brood frames in the flow hive. And the problem with the frames that Wendy and Ivan started with, they were following the flow hive company's recommendations, is that you start just with a frame and you have a strip of wood along here and you coat that with a bit of wax and then you put that in the hive. But as you can see, the problem is that the bees don't always attach it along the sides and along the bottom. So like with this frame, you can't hold it up easily to look for eggs. And also another disadvantage is that instead of confining the comb construction to individual frames, the bees can extend it to adjacent frames. They go sideways and go across, and that means that individual frames cannot be withdrawn for inspection. And I've had quite a number of beekeepers down here contact me about that, and very, very difficult to deal with, particularly if you're a new beekeeper. So highly recommended, start with, if you can, foundation on the frames. Here's the frame of foundation we got from the Nandina shop. We put it in positions 1, 3 and 9. Maybe in a month or so they'll have a look and see how that's gone. We're hoping that the queen is still there and she's hatched out and is starting to lay. If she hasn't, Wendy and Ivan will have to get a frame of brood from their friend and do the same procedure again. When I was out there on this day, it felt as though the sun was pushing down on your head, like it was just so intense. Of course, you should wear a hat. So what Ivan does on hot days, he puts up a shade cloth and an umbrella there, and that gives it a bit of shade. This is westerly direction there, so they get sun in the morning but shaded in the afternoon. The stingless hives are in a permanent structure, shaded from noon onwards, so they're pretty well right. I did have a bit of a beekeeper's question. Would this action temporarily and occasionally putting shade cloths up, would that affect the bees' navigation back to the hive? Have you got any comments about that question, Wendy and Ivan?
It doesn't seem to.
Yeah, okay, well, that's good to know. What else do you do to help the bees? We have to realise that European colony can use up to 1 litre of water a day to keep the inside of the hive cool. So the bees collect water from the environment, spread it over the comb, and then flap their wings to evaporate the water. And that essentially cools the hive. So in their backyard, Wendy and Ivan have got 2 sources of water for the bees. They've got a shallow dish with porous rocks. The water does seep up there, and the bees can actually stand on the side and suck water up with their tongue. The water also seeps up the rock, which is a bit porous, and the bees can land on the rock and obtain the water with their tongue. On hot days, the water gets so hot that it needs to be replaced because it's in the sun and does get quite warm. As well as that, they've got a deep pond about 20 metres from the hive, and it's got circulating water. It's like a little waterfall. The water gets pumped up to the top and it trickles down. The bees could get anywhere here and land on the rock and dip their tongues into the water. Ivan has had to put a screen over here because they've got a pet heron, not really, but a wild one, who, if it wasn't there, would come and feast on the little fish that are in here that eat mosquito larvae. Ivan, does that screen prevent the bees from going into the water?
Bees doesn't stop that. All bees allowed to, and also bees will come walk on a frame that wood, what you see it, closer there, it's always wet, and they suck the water. But mainly they like to come what is like a waterfall comes down on the side, on the top, and they drink it there and they take it back to hive.
Ivan took your advice and took the rocks out of the water and replaced it with timber because the rocks were heating the water.
Another thing that you have to deal with, and we do to a small extent down here, is small hive beetles. And it's a nightmare up along the humid east coast. A small hive beetle can decimate a hive in a couple of weeks. The adults go in, they lay thousands of eggs, they hatch out into maggots and basically destroy your honey because they produce a toxin which is very unpleasant to taste, but also quite dangerous to people who are immunocompromised. People who are successful with keeping European honey bee colonies in the tropics, they have to be on their guard against small hive beetle. So they've got something like we use down here is a beetle trap. This one actually happens to be made of stainless steel, and instead of filling it as we sometimes do here with a vegetable oil in which the small hive beetle drowns, the bees actually chase them into it. They put a substance called diatomaceous earth, which is actually crushed fossil diatoms, and it's actually a food grade one they put in. The position where you can put this, I think it's a bit inconvenient to put it between the flow frames, but you can certainly put it as we do here in this area here, if you've got normal frames, because what happens is that the bees actually chase the adult beetle into the trap. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the brood box. Now, as well as the trap, Wendy and Ivan have also got a sliding tray at the base of the flow hive, and they can put in that a layer of diatomaceous earth and leave that there for a few weeks or a month. And what happens is that the bees chase the small hive beetle into this, and they get coated with the earth. And the way the earth works is that it irritates their exoskeleton, so that becomes porous. And of course, that's no good for the small hive beetle. So it's a rather passive, it's not a poison as such. Now, one thing that Ivan has noticed is that after a few weeks, there's a lot of debris drops down into this tray, bits of capping, bits of wax, maybe bits of dead bee, and he finds maggots down here, or what we call larvae. And the question is, are those maggots small hive beetle, which we're trying to get rid of, or are they something fairly similar, wax moth larva? So if you look at these two photos here, we've got wax moth larva and small hive beetle larva. Small hive beetle larva have got 6 legs at its front end, and you can see them quite distinctly there, 3 on each side, and spikes at the end. Whereas the wax moth larva has got 3 main legs, but no spikes at the back. And it's also got sort of legs. They're called proto legs. They're not as functional as the main legs of an insect larva would be. So they're the 2 main differences. When young, both larvae can be similar in size. Of course, the small hive beetle is going to grow into something a bit smaller than the wax moth larva. It gets much larger when it's mature than the small hive beetle. And particularly with large infections of small hive beetle, they smell like rotten oranges. Louise?
Just wondered whether they have a problem with ants. I noticed on the native beehives, they've got like little socks on the port.
Just lose a bit of cloth, and that protects the small ants to coming in a hive. Usually I put the socket a little bit around kerosene and just put there, and ants straight away goes away.
Okay, thanks, Ivan. So on behalf of everyone, not only in Australia, but in New Zealand and in Maryland, I'd like to thank Ivan and Wendy for your presentation. And what we've found is that we can learn from each other. Even what you do with the stingless colony, they can help with our management of our European honeybee colonies, and maybe vice versa. So we'll look forward to hearing a report from you in a month's time. Thank you once again very much.